And welcome to the React Show, brought to you from occupied Serrano territory by me, your host Thomas, and a blustery morning, episode 77. And we're back into React server components, but don't worry, we won't be rehashing what we've already covered. I've just spent a lot more time with them, including a port to from an old site to a new site that now uses React server components, and I'll discuss what issues you'll likely run into with them. Thank you for joining us. I'm actually getting over being sick. I think I finally had the cold that everyone has had or something, but it knocked me out for a week or so. I'm starting to feel better. My voice is still pretty weak, so hopefully I'm feeling well enough I can record this episode in one sitting, but yeah, we'll see. I'm not entirely sure since my throat is a bit sore, and I haven't been talking much. I've been camping out at Joshua Tree National Park by myself, and just sort of recovering in my tent. And I don't know, haven't had much to say to myself, so haven't worked my voice too much. Either that or I kept everything in my head for once. I don't know, suppose that's possible. But yeah, as I write this and, the sun has risen on a new day and I'm scraping the, green out of an avocado and I am feeling quite a bit better. And a good thing too, because, I had to move campsites and it's a funny thing. Most of the campsites in the park now have been changed to reservation only, but my experience so far is that only about 50% of the people that reserve a spot actually show up. And funny, obviously that isn't the right word, right? It's more like frustrating. See on weekends, like now when I was writing this, all of the sites, if you go online, they're booked. But then only half the people actually show up. So half the sites sit unused. And for people like me that like to do things on the fly, there are never sites that can be booked on the weekend at the last minute. They get booked up months in advance. Super frustrating. I think the reason, and don't worry, this ties into everything, but yeah, I think the reason they, give for switching from first come, first serve to reservations or like a mix is that it prevents this thing where a group of people swarm campgrounds looking for sites, even when, maybe like during peak season, all the sites are actually in use. So you just have people driving around, right? So reservations seem like a potentially great solution. And I'm sure the thinking is like, well, now all the sites will actually get used and will prevent people from driving around their pollution spewing vehicles, clogging the roadways, looking for a campsite. But now you can see in practice, it doesn't really work that well either. Now the campgrounds are severely underutilized. And well, if you listen to this show, right, me, I'm always thinking about things in terms of design. And this seems like bad design. Just like in programming, a lot of things that, might initially seem like good design when you first concoct them turn out to be bad design eventually, based on things you learn later, like maybe some unexpected user behavior, like, people booking sites and then not actually showing up. Or when it comes to programming, more likely it's unexpected or hurried programmer behavior, right? or their boss told them to get it done, So anyways, this is why I'm so big on prototyping. And I think the National Park Service probably should have prototyped this ahead of time, or at least done it better. I just feel like it's essentially impossible to predict all the variables, and how humans will behave. It's much better to just quickly try things out and iterate based on the results. I think it doesn't, that type of thing doesn't fit so neatly in the box for budgeting and project management stuff up front, but it just works better in practice, in my experience at least. Anyways, speaking of prototyping, I've been hitting React server components pretty hard, and I've been prototyping a new website for this show, for the reactshow.com, based on Next.js 13 server components. So today I wanted to talk more about that experience, and also, unlike in some of the other episodes on this topic before, discuss more in depth some of the complications and potential downsides of React utilizing server components. I have a much better understanding of them now, and what the potential landscape might look like. So it seems like the right time. First up, though, I just want to talk about the design goals of the new website. You know me. That's where we got to start, right? And first, I want to talk about the old website and some of the issues we had there and stuff I'd like to design better in the new one. So the old website was actually hosted on Squarespace. We threw it up real quickly, didn't have time to code things, and it's been there ever since. It wasn't great for a lot of reasons. One of the biggest ones being it had a lot of duplicate work for me. So we host the feed for the actual episodes on a service called Buzzsprout, which handles syndicating the episodes and everything. But there's no connection between that and Squarespace. So I had to manually copy and paste data, and it wasn't structured. It was hard to work with, easy to make mistakes, that type of thing. I think Squarespace is kind of expensive. Another reason why, I'd like to get off of them. It's also really difficult to customize, and just a lot of user experience issues. I wanted better playback integration for listening to episodes on the website. On Squarespace, kind of the best I could do is embed episodes, and it wasn't great. But it also didn't. It has a members section, but I really want to create a much better sort of premium member section for the React show. Not something I've really talked a lot about yet. Been sort of prototyping it on Patreon. But yeah, the idea is I want to make it so that the show can be sustainable, and to do it in a way that provides value for the people that are sustaining the show. And so I have a lot of great ideas, but not easy to carry out on Squarespace. I've tried dabbling with Patreon, and I don't think it does a very good job for podcasts either, and for the things that I wanted to do with it, maybe having premium feeds and anyways, I don't really know what this is going to look like. If you're interested, I'd love to hear from you if there's anything you're looking for, but I'd love to create a really awesome community around the show, and just provide a lot of value for anyone that's interested. I don't know what we're going to call it yet. I've been calling it kind of the after show so far, but we could call it the reactors, the nuclei. I don't know, come up with some fun names, right? But yeah, anyways, that's sort of a side tangent. But I do want the new site to be able to support those type of features. And yeah, so I also wanted the new site to, like I mentioned, have better audio player integration, so you could, listen to episodes more easily and in a better format, have better support for transcripts. I've also been working on that recently. If you go to thereactshow.com, you'll see we do have some transcripts for recent episodes, which I'm really excited to have. And I'd like to have better support for that. Show notes, that kind of thing, just better, overall integration with the podcast. So those are the overall design goals. Of course, for me, I want it to be fast and good user experience, that type of thing. And, now that I'm recording this episode, I've actually deployed it. So you can go check it out. Thereactshow.com currently is now running on React server components in Next.js 13 that I deployed to my own server. Let me know what you think. It's still very much a prototype. It's not great code, doesn't have great test coverage, but I'm still trying stuff out. We'll get there. I'll include a link also to the source code, which is really bad, but if you're curious, you could definitely check that out. So yeah, the next step will be the process of actually creating this site and what I went through and that experience. So the first premise, I guess, is I didn't have much time to do this. I just don't. I don't have the budget to spend weeks on it. So I wanted to try to get it done as quick as I could. And so I actually started with a Tailwind podcast template. So they have some templates up now. And they had a podcast one, and I checked it out, and it seemed cool enough. Definitely like it would save me time. So yeah, I got that template. And also I wanted to experience porting, something to React Server components. And this template was not made for React Server components. It's made for traditional React. And so I could get that experience. So it seemed good. And I'll talk a little bit also about why Tailwind. So I haven't used Tailwind extensively. I've used it a little bit, but I wanted to get a better experience with it because it's so popular. I like to have experience with things, I'll be honest, I'm not super excited about it. I don't know if I think it's a whole lot better than, some of the other things I was using. But part of the problem with the other things I was using, which were the more common component libraries like Chakra UI, Material UI, that kind of thing, is they're based on CSS and JS libraries, which just don't work with server components yet. And they might not ever, at least in their current form. And Tailwind is nice because the classes are specified up front. And so you can send the content and the classes to the browser all, in the same request. And so essentially you can get content and styles all up front instead of having just sending the content and then later styling it, getting that white page with all that text. You can just get a nice styled page up front. I was like, that's a better user experience. I like that. I want that. So yeah, that's why I decided to go with Tailwind. So in this process, step one was just to get the podcast template working again in its original form. So I created the Next.js 13 project using the experimental app support, which is for React Server components, and then I put the template in here. So the site is running. My goal was to get it running in this, experimental form of Next.js in its original form. And the great news is this worked flawlessly. I didn't have to do anything, just copied the code in and ran it. And so that's cool because it means that it's backwards compatible. And step two then was to convert as much as possible to React Server components. And the approach I took was just taking the old pages directory and renaming it to app. So in Next.js 13, React Server component stuff goes in the app directory, and pages is kind of like legacy. So I just renamed it from pages to app and ran the project, and I was like, all right, let's see what breaks, And it was cool. It seemed like you could incrementally do this as well. So at one point, I tested out having a mix of stuff in the pages and the app directory, and you could link between them, and they seem to work seamlessly together. So you don't necessarily need to take this approach of just moving everything over. You could do it incrementally, and that's really cool. I think that's definitely a good way to do this, and it'll make it much easier to upgrade existing sites. But anyways, back to my experiment where I just moved everything over. Yeah, a lot of things broke, but it was pretty easy to tell what broke, which is important whenever you're doing this kind of thing. For the most part, it was just like these errors that are like, hey, you can't use context or use state or whatever hook inside a server component. So it was pretty straightforward, like, okay, this isn't going to work. But But then what I did is I was like, I just want to get it working again. So I went through and converted everything that was broken to a client component, just by adding the use client annotation to anything that was broken. And it took a little bit of, minor amount of refactoring and stuff, but for the most part, it was that simple. I just added use client to a bunch of stuff, and it got the site working again. It was great. It was like, okay, cool. So we're making progress. At this point, some things are running as React Server components. Most of it's still client components, but that's fine. We're making progress. Incremental progress. That's the way I like to do things, keep it running, keep it working, work your way through it, right? Of course, this is when, we get into the hard part, the nitty gritty, we have to actually sort of analyze the site and figure out, okay, if I did some refactoring, what could I sort of make as the minimum amount of components that needed to be client components. So essentially convert as much as possible to React Server components. You might not necessarily need to do this in all cases. It depends on what you're trying to do, but for the sake of me experimenting, this is what I wanted to do. Let's see how much of this I can run as server components, right? So I went through the source and identified the parts of the site that actually needed to be client side. For example, the template includes this really cool audio player that will just like play episodes in the background as you navigate through the site. Not just like while you're on one page, like you can navigate between pages and it'll keep playing your audio. This meant the audio player needed a context. And contexts have to be client side, right? The context will keep track of what's playing and your position and, allow you to pause and, play a new track or whatever, right? So I extracted just the context and the sort of functions around it into a new client component that only included the client side specific bits. There's also like some browser API stuff here that you have to interact with the play media and that kind of thing. This is all client side only. It doesn't exist on the server. So, it just doesn't make sense to do this any other way, right? So I extracted this into its own file. And that went well. And I also need to talk about a feature of Next.js 13. I don't know if they introduced this before. They might have, but in Next.js 13 with server components, they have this thing called a layout file. So essentially a layout file is like a normal page, component, file, whatever. But it spans multiple pages. So you would use it for normally like navigation, headers, footers, things that stay basically the same as you're navigating between the pages on your site, or at least a subset of pages on your site. So I created this layout file and I moved and I had that layout file reference the context client component. This way it would include this context on all the pages in my site. And so the layout itself is a server component and it includes this client component, and it all just worked. It was actually pretty easy. And at this point I could run the site and have my context and have the player available on all the pages. So even though it was getting included on a server component page, it was pretty easy to include on all the other pages. So that's nothing groundbreaking, but hey, it worked. It's cool. And that's the approach I took. The site continued to work. And at this point I had isolated the context part of the audio player and it's included on all the pages. So we're making good progress. Of course, I did mention that part of the context was interfacing with some browser APIs for playback, but there's the entire sort of audio player itself that also needs to be client side because of using browser only APIs and because it also uses events. You click a button and it starts playback and stuff like that, which can only be in client components. And honestly, so I converted it, and the process was, essentially similar, except I didn't need to put it in a layout file. I just put it in a normal, component and included it on some of the pages. So it was basically just identifying these things that needed to be client-side specific, moving them into a new file that had the use client annotation. I'll say, it did require a bit of work because a lot of times I found things that were client-specific stuff were mixed with things that could be rendered server-side. So if you're doing this yourself, you don't necessarily have to go this extreme approach of, putting as much on, to be rendered server-side as possible, right? But that's what I wanted to do, right? Try it out. So it did take some work to sort of separate these things and create new components, and but it wasn't too bad, I suppose. It wasn't too difficult, but it would totally depend on how interwoven these things are in your project. I could see this being extremely time consuming. But the bright side is, you don't necessarily need to do it at once. It looks like you could, for a lot of things, do it incrementally. Again, if you designed your project badly and you have a bunch of spaghetti code, it's not going to be easy. You're going to have to kind of do it all at once. It'll be a nightmare, but that's how working with that kind of code is. So, I don't think this is anything new. All right. So now there was one more thing I needed to convert, and to me, kind of the most interesting thing, and that was the data fetching. So the way I wanted to set this up is to have the website fetch the RSS feed and some other data from some other places that I had it, whether it's on the server or wherever. Anyways, it's got to fetch some data, right? So I was still doing this client side using the normal way we fetch stuff client side, right? But I really wanted to see what this was like to do it server side. And in the documentation for all this, they basically really super encourage you to do all your data fetching in server components. So I'm like, I got to try this out. Is it really better? Is it good? What is it for? Right? I have a lot of questions. Well, I figured this out. So I went through and did that, and it wasn't too difficult. It required a little bit more refactoring again to move some of the data fetching stuff into new components, blah, blah, blah. I mean, the drill: components, moving, refactoring, right? But the cool thing was this actually allowed me to remove a lot of code, just in general. So before, there were hooks, being used to fetch the data. The normal pattern, like your component renders, and you have a use effect that subscribes to data fetching, fetches data, whatever. It fetches the data. Then you're going to have a re-render. And the refactored version didn't need any of this. The hooks were all gone and all the loading states were gone, because the refactored version for the React server components, you can you don't have to have a use effect. You don't have to have hooks. Just in the rendering of your component, you can just await and fetch the data, using the fetch API. It's so much simpler. Oh my goodness. I loved this part of it. It was like, wow, this is really easy. Something that was sort of complicated before is just super simple now. It's just await, fetch data, process the data, display it. I love this. This is so much easier to work with. We're going to talk more about some, complications around this later on. It's not all, peaches and strawberries, or I don't know, whatever the saying happens to be. But I don't know, compared to the old code, this was just just better. I don't know any other way to say it. Simpler, better, easier to work with. And, it doesn't necessarily mean there's less re-rendering. That also depends on loading states you might want to show, that kind of thing. And it could actually be slower, depending on how you were fetching your data, we're going to talk more about this later, but it could mean an extra server is involved, since the data, might not actually be stored on the server that's rendering the component and that kind of thing. So I'm definitely going to talk more about this at the later stages of the show. We're going to get through the actual sort of process first here. But yeah, so that was really cool. And now I had a site that was completely converted with, only the stuff that needed to be client-side, inside client-side only components, and the rest were just sort of unannotated, which means by default they're a server component, but you can use them client-side too, as long as you're not, using something that can only be done on the server. So the await fetch thing I was talking about, that can only be done in server components. But a lot of the components, they don't do anything that's like client-side or server-side specific. So you could use them in both, places. You could use them as a client-side component or a server-side component. But yeah, most of my components, it seems from looking at the output, they are server components. They get rendered server-side. Awesome. So at this point, I would say, yeah, the conversion was complete and working. Of course, the next step was to actually deploy this and see how that went. And that also ended up being a bit of an adventure. So I originally tried to deploy it to Vercel. Vercel is the company that creates Next.js. And they provide a service where they'll basically just handle all the deployment for you. You give them your source code, and they do extra fancy stuff like, edge nodes and whatever, all for you automatically. Well, it didn't really work well at all. So it ran and I could deploy it. I ran into numerous weird issues where pages weren't loading, or not loading correctly, or partially loading, it would load, it had the layout stuff was there, and it would I don't know, it was really weird, navigating between things. It just seemed really broken. I eventually found some of it was known bugs and required upgrading to an alpha version of Next.js to fix it. And I tried that, and it did fix some things, but not everything. There were just weird things, and I just didn't trust it. And what seemed weird to me is that if I built the site and ran it locally, like a production build, I didn't run into these same issues. So I thought the problem was actually with how Vercel was deploying it, not necessarily Next.js itself. So then I deployed it on my own server, and sure enough, it all just worked. So yeah, definitely right now, Vercel is not ready for React server components, and at least, I don't know, using their default setup, I'm sure it's still a work in progress, but yeah, that does not work. But yeah, running it yourself seems usable. And, like I said, you're welcome to check it out. Let me know if you find any issues. Maybe there's stuff I missed, but yeah, just doing a normal production build seemed to work. All right. So I did notice some issues though so everything did work technically, but along the way I added my own feature that adds paging. So on the main page, you would go to the reactshow.com, and by default it was loading all 75 episodes, and it just seemed like it was loading a lot for the homepage, the initial page people might be going to. If you're on slow internet, that would take a while. And I was like, that's not really necessary. We can show the most recent ones and have a link to the rest. And so I created a paging system, just a normal run-of-the-mill paging system where you pass the page as a query parameter. So page equals 1, page equals 2, some buttons, pretty standard stuff, right? But it worked fine in development mode, but I noticed when I ran this in production mode, I started running into issues. So I ran into some issues, I would get this error oh, page switch from static to dynamic or whatever. And I'm like, oh, that's weird. Why? I don't understand. And then like sometimes I wouldn't get errors. It would just not work right. So it turns out I'm using the Next.js API to pass in the query params. Like this is part of their page API, even in the new version, right? But it seems like Next is unable to detect using query params, or what they call search params. And so Next doesn't know that the page needs to be dynamic. So in Next.js, you can have static pages and dynamic pages. A static page, it just renders it at build time ahead of time and just serves like static content, right? Dynamic is a page that, gets a request, and then on the server, it processes and, creates the page dynamically at runtime. And because I'm using this paging system where it's like page 1, page 2, page 3, I have different content that gets rendered depending on what page you're on. So in my head, I'm like, Next.js should be detecting this and, it should know this is a dynamic page. Well, that doesn't work. It definitely doesn't know. And so yeah, sure enough, looking at the build output, it was like, oh no, it's calling this a static page. It just doesn't know. I don't know if that's a bug, if they're planning on support it. I don't really know the situation, but that's what I ran into. And I don't know, playing around with it more, it just seems like Next.js currently is just assuming way too much stuff is a static page. Like nearly everything was a static page, even when I don't think it should have been. And it, depending on how you fetch data in your server components, it's also supposed to like do some sort of, I don't know if it's not maybe called a dynamic page, but like it will regenerate your static pages. Anyways, the whole thing seems a bit buggy. And to fix this, I just had to add annotations to a number of my pages to mark them as dynamic pages. This sucks. This will absolutely bite you in production. I don't like this at all. This seems like terrible design, relying on annotations at the top of the file. It smells like bad design to me. This isn't, I don't think this is really a React thing, but more of a Next.js thing, but they definitely need to figure out a better way to do this and like more correctly detect things. I don't know if this is planned. I have no idea. Maybe they know about this and I'm just using an alpha feature, and that's fine, whatever. I'm just noting it. And yeah, the truth is, if I had written more tests up front, I might have caught that. But good design, that doesn't rely on tests. You should have tests to catch things, but that doesn't mean you have good design. In fact, if you need tests to catch things, that probably means you have bad design. Anyways, now I have a fully working and deployed website with React Server Components. I got all those issues figured out. Everything works. And yeah, so that was basically the whole process. And now, we can get into the fun part, right? So I've got a lot more in-depth experience with React Server Components, Next.js 13. And I just wanted to chat a bit with you all at sort of a higher level, my thoughts on it, discuss some of the potential negative implications as well. All right, so first up, my overall feelings about React Server Components. What do they bias? What do they improve upon? Let's start there. I think there are what I see as sort of three big improvements. The first, and I didn't really talk about this in this process I went through just because for the most part I didn't run into it, but a big improvement could be not having to ship so many dependencies to the client. Another one would be streamed responses. So I'll talk more about that. And the thing that, you definitely heard me talk about, which was data fetching. So these are potentially some big improvements you could potentially see. So the most obvious one is not having to ship all your dependencies to the client. this is just a big win. I don't think there's going to be any real world site where this isn't a big win. And, just the clearest win, I think. When you need to process some data on the server anyways, and the corresponding libraries that you would use to process that data no longer need to be sent to the client. So a great example of this is, let's say you have a date, and you might send date in some machine readable format to the client. And previously you'd use a library to convert that to, something in the user's local time or whatever. And of course you could do this on the server before. But that people are generally doing this on the client for multiple reasons, which I'm not going to go into, but you don't have to do that anymore. You don't have to send this library to the client anymore. You can, convert this in your server component on the server. This is a huge win, and there's a lot of other use cases like this, right? So like I said, it was always technically possible, but I think this just makes it way easier to do things like the right way and, process and convert your data on the server. All right. So yeah, that's the first win. That's a pretty clear win. I don't think anybody's going to argue too much about that. That's cool. We're going to talk about, there is a slight complication to it, which we will get to. But I want to talk about another win, which are streamed responses. So with concurrent React, the server can stream components back to the client as they finish rendering, but before the entire tree gets rendered on the server. So I tried this out and experimented with it in this project I was working on, and it did seem like a big improvement. Like you could see it was sending parts of, like, basically sending components over to the client as they got rendered on the server. And this includes, like, from the data fetching side, if something is waiting to fetch data, it can render something that doesn't depend on that data and send it to the client, and the client would already render it and start incorporating it into the page. So yeah, this is a huge, huge improvement over before, where the pattern was, React would render everything and, it would have to do it all at once. And, if you fetch data, it would have to re-render everything again, after it fetches the data in the use effect or, with your query caching library, whatever. This is a clear improvement in my mind. This is really cool. I don't think there's too much to argue against this. It's really nice. But by far, the third thing is the biggest win to me is potentially this new API for data fetching. Like, you remember how excited I was. It just was so much simpler, right? This allowed me to use that simple await fetch. No need for complicated query caching libraries like React Query or SWT or using useEffect. Like, it just, it was so much simpler and super clean. I loved it. At least in terms, purely in terms of programming style and design, this is a massive improvement. And I'm quite certain programming in this style will yield much simpler code and fewer bugs. I really enjoyed it. Of course, some of you are probably like screaming, at the radio or wherever you listen, at your AirPods or, whatever you're listening to this on your phone, that there's some downsides, and we're going to talk about them. Definitely comes with some caveats. But depending on your situation, this could be an absolutely massive win in terms of the design and quality of your code base and just user experience in general. Okay. And now for the fun part. Let's have a real, chat here about the implications and potential downsides of, this new server components approach. And I want to start by talking about that last win, the new paradigm for fetching data. Well, it's clear from a code and design perspective, this could be an incredibly large improvement in my mind, and is one of the reasons before that I've said that React server components are just a foundational change. I mean, this is the primary reason I think for it. But there are a lot of complications to this one. For one, it assumes you are running a Node.js server. Even if you aren't running it as your main server, you need to run one to use server components. And so you might have to add a Node.js server to your pipeline. And if you have to add that to your pipeline, I mean, that adds complication, likely another round trip for data to make between servers, so that's not near as clear of a win, right? And at the same time, Next.js is, really, I'll be honest, at this point, pretty much dependent on you running a Node.js server anyways. So from that perspective, not much has changed. But if you aren't using Next.js and you want to use server components, you're going to have to add in Node.js in some fashion, at least for now. I could see a future in which this, potentially is changed if somehow other languages add support for running React on the server and rendering, React components in another language or something. I don't really know if any of that's been done yet. I could see that changing this equation. You've got your Ruby on Rails server. You don't have to add in a Node.js server because somehow your Ruby on Rails server can render React components, and use this new API and everything. That'd be really cool, but I have no idea how likely that is at this point, And actually, this was a point made by Dan, who wrote into the show, and, they were like, yeah, I mean, this seems like it requires running Node.js, which isn't at the top of their list. And it's really not at the top of a lot of people's lists, right? It just isn't. And another question that Dan had was, is this even useful for applications that source data from multiple servers? Or what about servers with multiple clients, not just React? So yeah, thanks so much, Dan, for writing in. I was wondering the same thing, so it was great to hear, from you, and so far, to get to the answer, I think it seems to be that React and certainly Node.js, certainly Next.js is pushing towards having a single or, sort of multiple redundant Node.js servers that sort of act as what I call the data nexus point. So I think essentially the idea is that you have a Node.js server that fetches, processes, renders, and generally coordinates all the data requests out to your other servers. So your React front end only talks to your React backends. And then those React backends are the ones that talk to everything else. So you can kind of think of it as having a backend dedicated to your front end. And the entire purpose of this backend is to sort of help out your front end. And I do think there is some sense in this. A lot of the client processing that needs to be done is going to be specific to the client, in this case, React. But it doesn't really actually need to be done on the client. So the theory, of I think the React and Next.js teams seems to be that ultimately some of this processing for a React front end is actually better off being done on a server. So you could really think of both the front end and back end as React, not really separating the two anymore between front end and back end, just like React is a front end and it is a back end. This is obviously a really big shift for the community. And, I'm not even sure yet how I feel about it entirely or what direction, things will go in. But it will mean a pretty major shift in the way that we write React code. This is definitely a case where I want to gain more experience on larger projects before knowing for sure how this, works, overall, like how I feel about it. And before we close out this part, we also have to talk about caching. So a very large part of what makes this work reasonably is that React added a new cache method. This method is supposed to seamlessly cache fetch requests on the server. So if you have multiple components that all fetch the same thing, it should only do the actual fetch once. So before something you definitely needed to do was like coordinate your fetches. You didn't want to fetch the same data twice in the same data path, right? And I think a lot of people ended up just using like React Query and SWT and stuff, partially for this reason. You'd sort of offload that responsibility to that library and let it figure out, oh, okay, I just requested this. I don't need to request it again or whatever. So the React team has actually added this support into React itself. And Next.js takes advantage of this. But Next.js also seems to have extended this cache method to also support some what they call invalidation techniques that tie into its static generation system. So you can mark a fetch call with an invalidation time. And after that time has elapsed, Next.js will regenerate any of the static pages that depended on that data. And if a page request comes in, it will refetch the data instead of, pulling it from cache. Actually, I think technically it will first reply with the data from cache, but then go fetch it and then regenerate it. Anyways, the point is more that they've extended what React created. And, this is where it gets interesting. So this essentially removes the need to add in React Query or SWT or any sort of query caching, I think. But caching is always hard. It's really hard, deceptively hard. So I'm curious just to see how well this API works. But at this point, I don't know enough, although if I'm going to go off my experience using Next.js and sort of some of the weird issues I think I saw, they might have been related to this. I don't know. But yeah, if it works well, this would be really nice because it'll be built into React and it seems simple. And hopefully they, get it all ironed out and it's just beautiful. That would be cool. Like we don't need to add these massive client-side libraries to handle this thing anymore. Yeah. I don't know. Time will tell, right? And, whoever hypes it on Twitter, probably, knowing the React community. Something I haven't seen discussed yet on Twitter, though, which admittedly might just be because I'm not that into Twitter. But nonetheless, I haven't seen discussed just how much React server components are tied into Next.js. This makes sense on the one hand because server components rely on having a specific routing mechanism in place and the internal support for like streaming responses back. But on the other hand, I haven't seen much support for anything besides Next.js, and Next.js is at least official support. And Next.js is just not the solution for every problem that React might be a good fit for. Now, the React team says they're working on some kind of more general purpose solution. But until we see what that is, we really only have Next.js as like the official support for server components. And this is, in my mind, kind of blurring the lines a bit now between React and Next.js. Where does React end and Next.js begin? I don't want to live in a world where my only option for using React is to use Next.js. But currently for React server components, this is really where we are. Hopefully this changes quickly, but given the buggy nature of Next.js's current implementation, or at least, getting it deployed to Vercel and everything, I'm not necessarily expecting anything anytime soon. Another thing that is kind of obvious, but we should talk about it anyways, is how this could actually slow your app down. If you need a component, but that component is on the server. Previously, you downloaded all or much of your app to the client. So what the client needed was often already downloaded, right? And it felt fast. It loaded right away once the data was there. This is definitely not the case anymore. And it seemed to me when I was messing around with it, Next.js is trying pretty hard to prefetch things. I'm guessing to sort of make up for this potential downside. So like it would prefetch components before it actually needed them based on, I don't know, what you mouse over. I don't know what the algorithm is, but prefetching can be fine, but it's definitely not the answer all the time. I expect we might see further developments in this area too, in terms of creating a more like detailed API for controlling prefetching. But regardless, this is not necessarily a clear win up front. I think with some good APIs for controlling when to fetch and render server components, it could be another win. But for now, I think it could also lead to worse performance. So there is still, I will admit, a lot to learn, I think, about React server components and sort of this new world they will usher us into. But I have, no doubt that the React community is very big on jumping on new things before they're ready. I don't know, for some reason, like remember hooks, Well, yeah, server components definitely aren't ready yet, and they definitely aren't the answer to everything. But I'm looking forward to seeing how the React community jumps on them with a vengeance, looking down upon anyone who deigns to only use client-side components anymore. And if we're lucky, we'll even get a lot of super nice looking infographics and plenty of memes prodding us down the golden path of React server components. But, all joking aside, I am excited. I think the overall, idea in my head is still that, it does make sense for us to do some of this processing on the server. It makes sense to do some things on the client, and depending on your project and your situation, it might skew one way or the other, but having the power and the flexibility to choose where your code gets executed is phenomenally powerful and a really good thing, in my opinion. I think there are a ton of open questions, and probably the biggest open question is what the community is going to do with this. Like, if I've seen anything from the React community, it's that they tend to sort of follow each other a bit like sheep, and whatever gets hyped, that's where people go. And that's what we end up getting libraries for, and that ends up being what learning materials are created for. And so I think a really big question is, where is the community going to go? Are people just going to jump on this and force us to make everything as server components? I hope it's more healthy than that, and I hope that's not where we end up. I could see that happening, but yeah. So this has been, a much more in-depth look at React server components. I had a lot of fun, sort of experimenting with them, building this new site. And yeah, I'd love to hear what you think. If you go check out thereactshow.com, again, I'm still thinking of it as like a prototype, but it looks like we're going to stick with it. And I'm really excited for some of the upcoming features that I can now add to it. But yeah, I'd love to hear what you think. If you check it out, do you notice anything interesting? If you're inspecting the page, looking at the responses or anything like that, Definitely let me know. Definitely let me know if you just like the site in general, if you're a fan or if you hate it. I want to hear either way, So yeah, definitely, if you get a chance to check it out, that'd be cool. If not, that's fine. I'll continue to, bring it to you in audio form, I'm sure. But yeah, this has been React Server Components. I'll probably take a bit of a break from talking about that for now. I got some other great ideas coming up. So yeah, stay tuned. But yeah, I'll definitely continue to follow this and, make sure that our community stays up to date on what they really are and how they really work and, what they're really like. Thank you so much for joining us once again. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day. Thank you and goodbye. See ya.